save what I was going to say at the start. I am going to talk a little bit about boxing in relation to Premier League football at the moment in a very vague way, and then try to offer some fairly vague thoughts about boxing and purity. I sort of do the thing about is boxing dying, which I generally don't have a lot of time for, but I think is relevant to consider. Hopefully all of you know Al Heyman, who is currently trying to monopolise boxing in North America. It's an interesting time to compare football and prize fighting, and a comparison I think yields surprisingly much, especially given how the Pinch-esque ghost Al Heyman seems set on taking boxing in a direction of complete corporatisation and monopolisation. With a few $100 million of venture capital funding him, Heyman's appallingly named Premier Boxing Champions looks to do with boxing what, for example, B-Sky B's Premier League has done with English football: turn a sport with a guaranteed customer base and the apparent potential for more into a monetised brand backed by TV and advertising. Of course, whether boxing does indeed possess a guaranteed customer base is a pertinent question, and the answer is doubtless one Heyman has gambled on. Yes, 5 million people bought Mayweather Pacquiao on pay-per-view platforms this last May, but this was less an audience gathered to watch boxing than it was to watch a couple of celebrities already well into their half-retirements. And the degree to which those people who did tune in felt deep dissatisfaction is already being felt. Viewing figures for the PBC are frankly paltry. In any case, the process by which Heyman has gone about creating the PBC is an interesting one. The big sell is obviously that boxing is back on free-to-air TV in America, though who cares is a good question given the ratings at present. Heyman's plan, ultimately, is to finance a year or two or even 3 with his vast venture capital purse, and then to sell the rights to his series to the same companies which at present host it. To become attractive enough to be bought rather than to buy is a difficult one, and Heyman's brand is obsessed essentially with being accessible. Not in itself a bad thing, particularly in a sport so convoluted as boxing, but at present rendered in such a way as to appear at least lightly infantilizing. Heyman's product has proven thus far to be less about fighting than it is about clean stages, neat backlights, and a uniform packaging. Boxing never cared all that much for turning its fights into simulated spectacles. People come to see a fight, really. But the PBC thus far has cared more for the simulation than it has for the fight. There is none of the shocking intimacy that boxing startles upon you at its best, but instead somehow a kind of recessed lag or delay, as though what you see live on PBC broadcasts has already happened sometime before you watch it. Commentary becomes, in turn, self-referential, no longer describing the action unfolding, but prescribing it instead. Language freed now to languish in its own atmospheric nourishment, to borrow from Eliot on Swinburne. There are now indeed so many fights that one can do without seeing, just as there are so many fighters one can do without knowing, something which flies directly in the face of descriptions of the sport as pure or fundamental, as so many writers have so long been fond of saying. There's often a naivety about such language, and I'm not about to suggest that it's Heyman who's overseen the sport's total disenchantment either. But at the same time, I can't resist the suggestion that there's something deeply true about much of it, the language and the decline both. Funnily enough, it is often watching other sports that reminds one of this. Note, indeed, how often in a football game, for example, the language of boxing is appropriated to describe what's going on. Teams perform rope-dopes, adapting the erstwhile strategy of Muhammad Ali to sit deep, soak up pressure, and finally strike. Or else they counterpunch, or even sucker punch, and with some luck they might land a fatal knockout blow. No one has ever compared 2 fighters going back and forth to 2 teams in a football match for quite obvious reasons, but in particular because boxing as a sport is so purely self-sufficient. Where football is a game, and only a game, with neatly drawn parameters necessary to the cultivation of a contest, boxing is actually boxing. Its rules super-added later on stop fights going to 110 rounds, as Andy Bowen and Jack Bird's fight in 1893 did, or else proving fatal. It is the pugilistic metaphor which in football creates significance, where in boxing it is the significance which creates its signifiers. The ball that passes the white line and lands in the net is not a knockout punch, but only as trivial as a ball going over a white line, while in boxing a knockout punch is actually a knockout punch, the sometimes fatal disruption of a fighter's sensory and cognitive capacities. Every sport is a combat between its participants, notes the writer Ted Wagland, but boxing is combat distilled. In boxing, after all, it is always the event which creates the metaphor, knockout, counter, sucker, and finally also the event which ends in eluding the metaphor. This is why so much writing on boxing, at least in prose, can feel so dead and so lifeless. Language is always felt trailing in the wake of something pure, fundamental, something felt. So the poet and publisher Daniel Halpern can only be half right when he says that perhaps in boxing, more so than with any other sport, we have before us the metaphor stripped down to its bare essentials, the ultimate emblem for all that can happen to the athlete, to the artist, to us all. Joyce Carol Oates gets much closer when she says that it is life that is like boxing, but boxing that is only like boxing. I've meandered for a while and will end in saying that Heyman might not mean the end of boxing as we know it, that it was only last week that the tremendous American writer Bart Barry, half in earnest, drew up a new calendar for boxing based on the BH and AH system, before Heyman and after. This is Barry again. Writing on the joy he felt seeing Nicaraguan Roman Gonzalez in early October, he describes it at the same time as a reminder that brings sadness now, of how much more we cared about prize fighting even 5 years ago, when there were stakes, when every match wasn't settled in the contract, when the opening bell rang on a championship match, and the promoters and matchmakers and commentators had at least half a sprinkle of doubt what might transpire. When boxing no longer resembles an event and needs instead the metaphor to constitute it, we are truly in trouble. I should be sorry to see prize fighting go out, Dr. Johnson is once supposed to have said. Every art should be preserved, and the art of defence is surely important. But all the while that boxing eludes the army of metaphors that follow it, it will only persist through the close attention of those same writer aficionados who utilise them. Once the likes of Liebling, Mailer, Oates, McElvany and others, now often dispersed about the internet and practising in relative anonymity. If all writings on boxing are mere after-images of an elusive event, we must yet seek out those which tremble and shine, to borrow from Prim. And as Ted Hagland also writes in an extraordinary passage, nowadays we're flooded and swimming for dear life, no matter where we happen to live, that we nevertheless prefer our sports violent, the irreducible conciseness of boxing, is evidence of a relation to violence, a need and a curiosity so basic that it cannot be sated. Though we do tire of the delirium in the streets, we are only tiring of the disorder. As he concludes, make it concise, put ropes or white lines around it, and we will go, just as people on vacation go down to the roaring sea.